The last part, I think, in my opinion, remains the most important part. This is a panel discussion. And may I invite Professor D.N. Reddy, Barham. Randhir has excused himself. He had some important function. Mahesh, Dr. Mahesh Goenka, Dr. Naresh Bhatt, Dr. Amol Bapaye, Dr. Sandeep Laktakia, Dr. Rajesh Puri, and Dr. Mohan Ramchandani. So this is a space for all of us to dream for the next half an hour to 45 minutes. We have heard some very exciting talks, some very exciting developments, some exciting peeps into the future as to what we are looking forward. But here we will pick your brains a little bit on your, one is science. We are all scientists. We are all gastroenterologists. We look to evidence. But beyond evidence, we all have certain hopes and wishes as to, I hope this was possible. So this section deals with that as to what you feel is missing and what you feel should be done to make gastroenterology and endoscopy much better in your opinion. Let us then start with Barham. Barham, you gave a fantastic lecture on the exciting research that is going on in the field of metabolic endoscopy. Now, what I want to ask you is, A, how fast are these technologies going to be available? And B, the cost effectiveness, and C, your wishes, personal wishes, apart from the research, what you think is missing and what needs to be done faster?
Excellent questions. So first is how fast these are going to be available. These are coming in very fast because number one, there is a huge unmet need. Number two, there is industry partnership and engagement. And number three, there is partnering with payers, governments, and societies to push these through. So the fact that we have a Category 1 CPT code in the United States to address this, and fields like ESD have been in there for years and they still do not have the code, indicates how urgent need for these interventions are, and we will see them. So that's number one. Number two is the cost effectiveness, which is an important consideration. And here I would always argue the opportunity cost. So there is a price for inaction. So taking somebody who's metabolically diseased, we know that introducing at least 10% total body weight loss could have dramatic impact on progression to type 2 diabetes, cancer risks, and all the metabolic consequences that comes with that. So the cost effectiveness story becomes, if you could spare somebody the risk of type 2 diabetes or being on insulin for 2 years, then you automatically have a cost effective intervention by default. So that's the key, is there is an upfront cost for these interventions, but the long-term cost is dwarf this upfront cost because the cost of untreated excess adiposity is detrimental to not only to individual patients' health, but also to societal health in general, both medical and non-medical reasons. So third is, what is the future? The future is fascinating and exciting because we've known now since Roux-Y gastric bypass was introduced and became a gold standard for treatment of obesity and metabolic disease, that the answer must and is in the GI tract. So the question is, how do you take the answer, which is in the GI tract, and scale it to the wide population? And the closest analogy of this is the field of cardiovascular medicine. We used to plug arteries with a CABG or open heart surgery. So the same thing is happening to this field. We know that the answer is in the GI tract. We know that we could alter this physiology through endoscopic means, and this is on very rapid incline. What excites me a lot in this field is introducing these new thermal modalities that allow us to ablate large surface areas. So now in mucosal areas, we could ablate centimeters at a time, circumferentially and throughout the depth of the GI tract without the risk of perforation. And this is excites me for both the metabolic benefits. So that means you could ablate the stomach and the duodenum for the added benefits for metabolic disease, but also for non-metabolic or non-bariatric indications like I detailed above, with early cancer or even more invasive cancer or treatment of muscle-based disorder like achalasia and what have you. So that's a very exciting development in our field that I look for, to the future too.
Great. So, Baran, one question to you. You said pharmacotherapy and endotherapy are the important components. How do you see it panning out? Is it going to be more pharmacotherapy or more endotherapy, or is it?
So we know pharmacotherapy is not a new thing. Pharmacotherapy have been in the US market for more than 10 years, actually, and more than 20 with different iteration of pharmacotherapy. Older or newer agents, some of them were quite successful, but the problem with pharmacotherapy is multiple folds, including compliance with medications. We know that patients are not very compliant with medications. Number two, most of these agents are targeted agents. That means they work on a single pathway. And we know that the concept of tachyphylaxis is real. That means the first 3 months is a very nice honeymoon period for these medications. But after that, the effect doesn't mean that they do not have an important role. They have a very of disease. So in disease, you start with pharmacotherapy. If you have moderate with endoscopic intervention, if you have severe, but as any chronic disease, there is no cure for a chronic disease like obesity. That means the spectrum has to be fluid, and you have to add things to maintain the response over time, because there's no cure. And that's where, if you start with pharmacotherapy and the response is waning, that's where you graduate to an endoscopic intervention. Or if you start with endoscopy and now the response is waning, that's where you add a medical treatment or a medication to it. And same principles apply to surgery, where you could add endoscopy or medication. So I think for a chronic disease, we should not withdraw intervention or have the panacea that there's going to be one treatment that's going to cure all, because it's not going to exist in a complex disease like a polygenic disease like obesity. The idea is building the toolbox and increasing access to effective treatment for the 99% of the cohort that does not have any therapeutic intervention for this disease process.
Thanks. Nadi, I come to you now. We have been using endoscopes now for more than many decades. I am myself using it for more than 3 decades. We started with fiber optics, then came to video, and good advances in endoscopes. But somehow I believe that the endoscope growth in design has not kept pace with the technology growth outside of endoscope. If you look at radiology, for example, the growth is exponential. If you look at other areas, my son plays with his video games, and I feel, we are probably working with 19th century machines with so many coils of wire and so many things going inside. I want to know from you how you feel about the endoscopy design and what you want to see in the future.
So, Vinay, that's a very important question, because we have been using the same endoscope in the last 60 years. There's no change in the design. The only change that occurred in endoscopy was better imaging. So the imaging we had with fiber optic earlier, to videoscopies, to high definition scopies, to enhanced imaging. So imaging has improved dramatically, so that what we used to see earlier is now completely changed. But the mechanisms, or mechanistically, the endoscope has not changed. In fact, about 10 years back, we had a meeting on endoscopy design. We called all the prominent design engineers in the country to sit together along with our colleagues. And the first thing when they saw this was, this is primitive. They're saying, how are you working with this model where your both hands are holding the scope and you're having knobs to turn it around? And they say that for 2 reasons. One is in terms of ergonomics, that is how you move your hands and hand-eye coordination. And second is what all the procedures in terms of therapeutic endoscopy you are doing now has to be done in a 360 angle. That is, triangulation is very important. With the endoscopes, we can only move parallelly all the instruments. Even in the double channel, we cannot do triangulation. So the design of the endoscope, especially for therapeutic procedures, is, I think, dramatically less than what it should be. Now, the reason why this endoscope started initially, because endoscopy started as a diagnostic procedure. So the whole endoscope design was diagnostics. It never changed. It went on like that. And we have started adapting it and trying to do all sorts of complex procedure with these endoscopes. To some extent, ERCP and US scopes have been designed specifically for this procedure, so that it will better off. But upper GI colonoscopy have to change in terms of putting in triangulation, how the knobs are moved and so on. When notes came in about 10 years back, this thinking became very strong and many new endoscopy designs came. In fact, we've had opportunity to play with the different types of endoscopes where you can actually use triangulation. In fact, you're using your hand like using it on a PlayStation and then used to play around with the scopes. But unfortunately, to convert this into commercial use has not been possible because if you look at endoscopy industry now, it's just dominated by 3 manufacturers. And what happens in terms of design is decided by these 3 manufacturers. If they want to change it, they'll do it in a particular way. If they don't want to, as long as they all keep the same technique, it'll remain like this. It won't change. Now, whether in future we can influence them to change is a question whether it will happen at all, because design changes, unlike image changes, are a paradigm shift. So it's going to become expensive in terms of validating that this scope is better than others and so on. And also the indications. If you're dealing only with luminal endoscopy, the indications for doing triangulation and all will be very less. What you require is good suturing techniques, technology, and so on. But if you are going to deal with notes-like procedures, where endoscopists go into the peritoneal cavity and start doing notes-like procedures, you definitely require triangulation. And that's where new endoscopies are coming in. Anyway, the new designs, especially in the area of robotic endoscopy, in fact, Barham and his group have just acquired a robotic endoscope to work in the rectal area where triangulation is not all possible. The maximum, I think what is going to happen in terms of maximum advances are in terms of robotic endoscopy where triangulation and all are going to be brought in. And there are at least 3 manufacturers who are working now very strongly. Unfortunately, COVID has sort of damp down the enthusiasm a little, but they're working very strongly on this. And my feeling is that within next 2 or 3 years, we're going to see a completely different design of endoscope, especially to aid in therapeutic processes like ESDs, notes-related procedures, and so on. We're going to get different endoscopes. There are other group of endoscopes, like, for example, spike cholangioscope and all, which took, in fact, the first cholangioscope came in 1970. It took almost 30 years for cholangioscopy to become commercially available. I think, again, the conservative mindset that we have in terms of this. So I think this is because as endoscopists, we are limited by what we get. We don't have engineers in our department to tell us what can be done separately. I think that is very essential to come in. But I feel with what's happening in the field of endoscopy, in next 2 or 3 years, we are going to see major changes in terms of triangulation, different types of endoscopes, artificial intelligence, which is going to be added on to our endoscopes and so on. Imaging has reached its peak. I don't think we can go beyond this in terms of better imaging. We are going parallel with the optical camera industry, getting there as good as they are. I don't think we can go beyond this, but what is going to change in terms of artificial intelligence and mechanistically, we're going to get better endoscopes.
Thanks, Nagi. So you think the reasons why it's not changing are financial?
Yes.
Okay. So that
the whole endoscopy industry is financially driven. It's all finance. It's like economy. And if something is going to drive the economy, it will immediately change to that.
Because you look at the virtual platforms and the AI platforms in other areas, and you feel probably we are, way behind in technology as far as endoscopes are concerned. But let's hope that there are certain changes in the future.
AI platforms are already available now, like Genius from Medtronic and others. They are making the first breakthrough. But the problem with AI for us is that as endoscopists, understanding and implementing this is not very comfortable. So therefore, we are not pushing it as much as the industry. But if the industry and the medical personnel see an economic advantage in it, it will be pushed very rapidly.
Thanks, Nagi. Thanks a lot. Let's move to the next area. We all have been brought up on the love of ERCP. So, Mahesh, Ranveer unfortunately had to go for some function. So, I would ask Nagi to please also talk about this. Is Mahesh around?
Yes, very much.
Hi, Mahesh.
Hi. Hi.
Welcome, Dear Care. Thank you very much for sparing your time. So I again come with the same thing. We started with fiber optic ERCP scopes and we have seen great advances, 5 decades of ERCP. I think ERCP is enjoying probably its golden period in the last probably 2 decades. But it can't be the end, right? There are many things which need to be done. And for me, as a ERCP person, a simple thing, a simple need I have is why is there not a device which tells me at the papilla that go in this direction to the bile duct? I'm just dreaming here. So I want to hear from you. What you think would be needed to improve ERCP further? I'll ask biliary endoscopy from you, and then Nagi can talk about the pancreatic endoscopy.
Sure, Vinay. First of all, congratulations, Vinay, for completing 1 year of Ideal Care, and congratulations to the whole team. I think what Nagi said about the endoscopy designs, it doesn't actually hold true if we talk about the biliary aid of doing an ERCP. And I remember my first ERCP was somewhere in 1988, almost about 32 years back. It was really primitive. We had one green wire, very rigid, a lecture scope to work with. And obviously the lecture scope will be taken out when you are doing the critical period because it will reduce the light. So I think from there, we have progressed quite a bit in the last 3 decades. And if I have to, before talking about the future, if I have to talk about 2 or 3 things which really has made the difference, I feel, is one is guide wires. I think we have much, much better guide wires today, including the hydrophilic wires, than what we used to have 3 years back, 3 decades back. I think the balloon sphincteroplasty, it's a small change, but it made a huge difference in our approach to the bile duct stones. The third thing which I feel, and we discussed some time back in another meeting, is the cautery. I think the cautery now, gone are the days of zip cutting and all those. So we have much better cautery. And finally, cholangioscopy, which Nagi just talked about. If I go about more specific, I totally agree that it's a dream for us to have the cannula or the sphincterotome follow our advice. I remember Nagi talked about one meeting, and I was in one of such meetings with Nagi organized, where we had meetings with engineers from Singapore, and they said it's not so difficult that you generate a cannula or a sphincterotome which will follow what you want to do. Maybe some chromo artificial intelligence or something which attracts the bile duct, bile will attract the cannula towards it. I think so. We are struggling even now in about 2 to 5% of the patient for selective biliary cannulation, and also when we reach the hilum to selectively enter a duct. So I think some device in which the sphincterotome follows what we want is very, very important. And I don't know how this dream will become reality, but this is something which is still rate limiting step in our success. Absolutely. Coming to the other situations, I think stents. We have again improved a lot so far as the stents are concerned, particularly the metal stents. But when you talk about benign biliary strictures, I think while we now know from some of the excellent work done from India as well as elsewhere and published recently, that metal stent seems to be the answer for benign biliary stricture. But still, there is a significant migration rate for these stents. And in benign biliary strictures, the migration rate is not insignificant. So I think we still need some stent which are as good as metal stent, but the risk of migration is low. Now, whenever we put in a benign situation, we have to remove these stents after some time. So there are 2 developments which has taken place, but yet not reached success. One is biodegradable stents. We still know that biodegradable stents do not have as much of radial force as we want it to have, and there's always a restricting problem. And the second, which I was reading recently, is that magnet-driven stent, so that there's a magnet at the end of a plastic stent, and from outside maneuverability, you can remove the stent. So these are some of the exciting advancements which are taking place, and I hope these dreams which some of us are seeing will become true. So far as the malignant strictures and the stents are concerned, I think we need to have the advantage of both the covered and the uncovered stent. When the covered stent came about 17 years back, we thought we got a final answer to reduced tissue ingrowth, malignancy ingrowth. But then we also had to face the problem of migration. So I think the advantage of both a covered and uncovered stent has to be designed in such a way that we have an optimum stent. We're still struggling with drug-eluting stents for malignancies. Though there are some initial trials being done, but I think we need to have a drug-eluting stents which can increase the patency of these. So far as the stone disease is concerned, I think now the stones are within our field in more than 95% of the time. But you would all agree that for large stent, complicated stones, we still have to do multiple ERCPs. So I think we need to have a way in which the number of repeated ERCPs are reduced in these difficult stones. We still do laser, we put stents, we go back and find some residual stones. So it becomes 3 or 4 ERCPs. It's only about 60 to 70% of the time that a large stone is removed at single ERCP. I think more than that, Nagi talked about cholangioscope. That's a big advantage which we have today. But if you look at the maneuverability of SPY-scope and the direct cholangioscopy, the images of SPY-scopes is still not as good as that of a direct cholangioscopy. So you want an amalgamation of the advantage of both SPY-scope as well as the direct cholangioscopy to have better images as well as have good maneuverability. So I think these are some of the issues which we hope will improve in the coming time. Of course, the cost factor, the transmission, and a small but definite risk of pancreatitis. In spite of pancreatic stents, in spite of hydration, in spite of rectal indomethacin, we still are afraid of post-ERCP pancreatitis. So I think we need to have a magic of taking care of this post-ERCP pancreatitis, because that continues to be a big stumbling block for our practice of biliary endocrine.
Mahesh, one area I want to ask you before I go to Nagi, cystic duct and gallbladder through ERCP. That is one area which I think.
If you talk of gallbladder approach, I think through the ERCP you can reach the gallbladder. But we know that tackling the problem inside the lumen of the gallbladder is not the end to itself. We know that these gallbladder are diseased gallbladder, and I think as of today, except when the surgery is very high risk, if there's a gallbladder disease, it's better tackled by surgery. If you talk of a cystic duct stone after in a stump, yes, that's an area which we can tackle now also, and there may be some improvement in the coming time.
Yeah, thanks. Nagi, if you want to add something on the bike, and then
So Vinay, I think as Mahesh has rightly pointed out, most of the advances in this area has occurred because of accessories. Again, you see scope-wise, nothing major since we started using the scope, except that better imaging and video scopes from fiber optic scope. The major advantage is accessories. Again, accessories, it's a commercial thing. Accessories market is good. So company starts innovating and they get along with doctors, and then together we make several studies to show this particular accessory is better and so on. And also, the effect of introducing a new accessory is very dramatic. Suddenly you find that you can control bleeds better, you can actually put in stents easier, and therefore the impact is higher, so it comes very easily, very fast into the market. But I want to suggest one controversial, very revolutionary thing, and this is that what if I suggest that after 4 or 5 years, we stop doing ERCP, no more ERCP, only US. Everything can be done with US. I think you guys will be happy to support, but this is something that comes into my mind.
I think Nagi, me and you should retire before that happens.
Yeah, that's why I said 4 or 5 years, Mahesh. By the time we are old enough to retire, then
I think this is, on a serious note, I think what we need to have is these supplementary techniques. We need to define as to which is better in a particular situation. I think there's a lot of gray zone at now. Yeah. Vinay may believe that after your failed cannulation, you do in the US, whereas I may believe that I will do a pre-cut. So I think these are some of the gray zones, and one of the two studies are not going to change the whole scenario. We need to have consistent external and internal validation to clearly understand what should the algorithm in these difficult situations.
I think this is going to the next major trust. I think the most of the studies now in future are going to come in this area, comparing these modalities. In fact, 3 very good papers came on primary biliary cannulation and decompression from Shyam Varadarajulu and from Korea. 2 more papers, which I think these are the exciting papers that are going to come in future to change. Whatever comes is going to change. Clinical practice is going to have an impact. And I feel that our direction and thrust should be towards that. And we are, I think, Mahesh, coming to the fag end of our careers. I think maybe we are lucky that we escaped this, but I think soon, at least, I see fairly dramatic changes in my approach to these patients with pancreatic biliary disease.
Agreed, Nagi.
Nagi, pancreatic duct. Yes, we have made again great improvements in the lives of the patients with pancreatic endotherapy, ESWL. Still, lots needs to be done. There are patients we can't help. Anyway, I think endotherapy can improve here.
There's very little we can do in pancreatic endotherapy because most of the pancreatic endotherapy for benign disease, for stone disease, is based on extracorporeal shock wave. Endotherapy itself doesn't do so much except a pancreas divisum. There are also a lot of controversies whether this should be treated or not. There are occasional patients with anatomical abnormalities like a choledococele or a duodenal diverticulum which can be dramatically treated with endoscopy. Otherwise, for recurrent pancreatitis, we have very little in form of advances in endoscopy therapy, and I can't see much future because there the work has to be on genotypic identifications, and only very rare anatomical defects can be corrected by endoscopic therapy. So I don't see much advances that are going to occur in endoscopic therapy of pancreas. We are not going to change much. What is going to happen again is the field of endosonography, where we already a lot of work is being done in terms of treating patients with walled-off necrosis in different ways. So many studies are coming. For pancreatic ductal therapy, even axaries, like Mahesh told you, so many advances in biliary therapy. Unfortunately, for pancreatic endotherapy, axaries are not advancing. Just to get at a self-expanding metal stent, completely covered stent, we have been working on it for last 5 years to see if we can replace this, and nothing has come out of this. We find that these stents are not ideal for pancreas. Many of them are migrating very high. So finally, even the industry is giving up. They say there's no point in putting your money there. So I think my prediction is that in terms of pancreatic ductal therapy, we're not going to see much changes in endoscopy.
Okay. Mahesh, any opinion?
Yeah, I would only add to whatever Nagi said that it's sometimes very frustrating that you have a dilated duct and you drain the duct effectively and yet the pain does not go. Because we now understand that the pain is multifactorial and it may be more neurological rather than hypertension, ductal hypertension. So I think that's sometimes very, very disappointing that you have drained the duct very well, but the patient doesn't get the pain relief. And even if you do a celiac axis block or anything, it is very temporizing. So I think I would agree that we are still far away from a very good situation so far as the pancreatic endotherapy is concerned.
Okay. Thank you both very much. We should move to image-enhanced endoscopy. Naresh is here, and I am a very staunch pancreatobiliary guy, fed up on the diet of ERCP and EUS, but of late, so much has come on image-enhanced endoscopy that I have started taking interest again and started reading books. You know, Nagi published a book long back on NBI. Naresh?
Yes, Vinay.
Hi, Naresh. Hi. Welcome back. Great advances, no question about it. The way we look at small lesions now is completely different from how we were looking at them or probably ignoring them a few years or 1 decade back probably. Now we are very, very curious as to this bump. What is this bump? Let us look at it, put on NBI, maybe enhance the image further, and with the artificial intelligence coming. So raise some of your valid concerns rightly in the evening. I want you to expand on it further. So it's a great advance, no doubt about it. How do you see, what are the limitations and what more you think, apart from cost? Of course, cost is a problem always. Would you like to see?
The big problem, Vinay, is that, I think we need to, first of all, move away from just conventional white light endoscopy. We need to take, at least most endoscopies in India, we need to take 2 steps forward. At least to go on to good white light imaging, spend time and try and deliver results there, not looking for huge tumors and things like that are obstructing the lumen. So I think first is changing our own mindsets. I think that's where it needs to start. Once we move from there to a little, at least, good white light imaging, basic NBI with magnification if we use, we are really almost at 95, 96%. The more expensive gadgets is something that we can't afford. And I don't think are going to add too much of benefit to our patients, except maybe 1% there. I think we can forget that part because we need to do greater good for the community. I think that's where my sort of dream is.
Okay. And, precursor lesions, Barrett's, atrophic gastritis, intestinal metaplasia. We do screening in a few patients of Barrett's. We don't look much at atrophic gastritis. You think these new techniques will force us to relook upon these things and maybe increase the detection rates of small cancers or precancerous conditions?
Now, see, I have been using maybe the second generation NBI. I'm not into third generation. I'm not into these higher zoom scopes or the newer thing which has been launched. But I think short of that, I think we are almost doing a good enough job. That is the point that I think we don't have to take that big jump, spend that much more money. All we need is to train ourselves in what is available. I think we are making bigger mistakes in white light endoscopy, and we are dreaming about wanting to do endocytoscopy. I think somewhere we've sort of going on the wrong track.
Okay.
So our training needs to be much more stronger, more robust in all institutions. If you look at training institutions across the country, I think there's a huge gap. Most people don't know how to pick up, say, GERD, how to pick up a hiatus hernia, leave alone early gastric cancer or studying Barrett's.
Yeah.
So I think we systematically need to strengthen that and then continue that process of encouraging them to become good diagnostic endoscopists. What has happened now, we pushed the whole therapeutic pathway. No questions, it's important, very, very important. But when I went to the National Cancer Center at Tokyo, they have a specialized unit doing therapeutic gastric ESDs and colonic ESDs, EMRs. All right. But for every one patient that they do there, they have a parallel unit where Professor Matsuda and his group, they've got a whole lot of endoscopists who are doing all the screening, and they're doing such brilliant work. And they are selecting those patients who go to patients for ESD or specialized therapeutic. So we need to understand that that's a huge area that we need to sort of look at, need to tap and deal with these patients adequately before just concentrating on our EMR, ESD or POEM or whatever. So we are ignoring a big chunk of endoscopy, which is, basic endoscopy or not even image enhanced, just adequate imaging.
Yeah, I think I get your point. The way we do diagnostic endoscopy has to change. I think that's a very, very valid point. So here, Nagi, what we are doing is we don't have great number of patients and we are not very busy, so we keep doing these things. So we select patients who are, for example, smoking for 20 years, who have a family history, who are alcoholics, and we advise them endoscopy. And this group, we do PEP test, and if the ratio is negative PEP1 to PEP2, these patients will pick up for enhanced endoscopy. And I spend 35 to 40 minutes each endoscopy. And very few I have done. This is only past 6 months that I have started doing this. And it is, I think we need this kind of data from India. It is non-existent because I don't believe that we don't have precursor lesions, that we don't have intestinal metaplasia going into early cancer. It is just that, as Naresh is rightly pointing out, probably the way we do endoscopy is different. We are looking for something which is very obvious.
Yeah, I think, Vinay, in fact, there's a Japanese study which showed that if we take all patients with head and neck cancers,
Right.
and then carefully do a NBI magnification,
Yes.
then about 5% of them, they actually picked up a very early lesion which could be removed endoscopically. So the problem with this is the time required, the time, and whether it works out in terms of economics for us. These are the two problems that we have.
I totally agree.
Nagi, you earlier in the evening you spoke about digestive health, and Vinay is now talking about intelligent endoscopy of selecting those patients that you need to spend time. I think that's a good start in itself.
Yes.
I think that's where we need to go and train more and more people into that aspect of endoscopy. For every 10 of them, we can have one guy who's good at ESD or whatever. So
You're right, Nare. I think we'll subdivide, and somebody should be doing this specifically without having to think about the next IBS patient or something. That's important.
Very great. Thanks, Naresh. Fantastic ideas. I think very, very relevant, very practical for our situation. Let's move on from here to third space. Amol, we have been discussing about image enhanced endoscopy picking up.
Yeah, I was listening to that actually, and
now coming to therapy of these things. Under your guidance and Mohan and Amit, great strides India has taken in third space endoscopy, no doubt about it. And we have been the interest is there. Lots of people want to learn. Lots of people want. So how do you do people who you think will be doing good third endoscopy, and how do you train? Because the demand must be built up now. I feel there are a lot of excitement. I think this happened in EUS about 6-7 years back. Now third space endoscopy, there is a lot of demand. So I want to ask from you, how do you see in India the training needs being met?
okay, yeah. So I think Vinay, you've hit it, right on the nail. Training in third space endoscopy. See, let us try and understand that there is, as I, mentioned a little bit earlier, sometime earlier, when I spoke after Philip's talk. See, third space endoscopy or endoscopic surgery, I would put it as a slightly more broad outline. Now there is a lot of mindset change, and it's all about mindset, because traditionally most of the endoscopy so far has been the field is dominated by physicians, and there are very few surgeons actually who are doing this. And endoscopic surgery and third space endoscopic resections actually is the bridge which is being approached from both sides by physician endoscopists and surgeon endoscopists. Now, I don't want to get into the details of who should do from a degree point of view, that is immaterial. But what is important is that the physician has to be aggressive enough to think like a surgeon. And at the same time, if a surgeon is doing this, he has to be able to be considerate, moderate, and compassionate like a physician. So that is the bridge, and that is the merging which is very important. Also, I do believe that these procedures require a significant amount of technical skill, and these skills cannot come very easily and cannot come in the first 2 or 3 years of GI training. So I think people need to be patient. Most of the young gastroenterologists who sign up for our hands-on courses and all that, so we always select them and we tell them that, see, we'll take you maybe 1 year from now or 2 years from now rather than just now. Because a first year or a second year GI resident probably is still learning his upper GI and colonoscopy basics. He's just trying to get his side wing scope inside, and that is not the time that these people should start doing or thinking about third space endoscopy or resections, because it requires a considerable amount of hand skills, hand-eye coordination, all these things are very important. And with that having said, I think regarding the training per se, when we're sure that the trainee per se is a competent and a qualified person to be trained, then I think, see, all of us have learnt our endoscopy on patients, but then I think that time needs to change. For once, these procedures are really quite complex and complicated to stand alongside. See, one of the main differences in endoscopy training as compared to surgical training is, in surgery, the senior surgeon is assisting actively the junior surgeon while the junior surgeon is operating. Whereas in endoscopy, the scope is either in your hand or in my hand. And all that I can do is I can tell that person, but by the time I tell, if he's moved the knife in some other way that I did not want to, he's landed the patient into a problem, and it could be a major issue. So that is the biggest challenge in endoscopy training. That is what I feel. And because of that, I think there is more and more importance for simulation, simulators, as well as cadaveric and animal model trainings that need to be considered. The other important thing is, at third space and endoscopic resections, I think very few centers have the numbers to justify a training program. And I don't think, see, even if we're doing, see, I think there are a handful of centers in India and even otherwise who are doing sizable numbers to justify training. But then these patients are coming from far and few. All of them are, these procedures are quite complex, and we don't want to risk our patients for, to hand them over to your junior, trainee. And so I think, the training modules with, simulation and even AI probably, and computerized simulation as well as animal models would be very important. I think that would be important. And apart from that, if you wanted to ask me about my dream for third space, I think third space has begun, but I think it can be used more and more as an access endoscopy or an access for more intra-abdominal surgery. And for that, probably we need to have what Dr. Nagi mentioned, is we need to have more surgical endoscopes where we can have triangulation, retraction, and all these things. And then, of course, the other equipment and instrumentation will follow.
I think there is a report of a cholecystectomy done from the cardia recently.
Yes, there is. So a lot of things are possible.
Yes.
But yeah, that is true.
Nagi, I'll come back to the same question to you. Is it possible I keep getting requests for training in EUS-BD or therapeutic EUS, and I keep refusing them because we don't have the modules. Is it feasible to have training programs for third space, interventional EUS, or you think, as Amol said, models is the only way to go?
See, the problem with models, Vinay, is that you don't get the real feel. Very often, we don't have ideal models. Been involved in developing a model too, getting an ideal model. So models help to get the concept, especially some of these models we use for, say, Vaughan drainage are fairly good. They give a feel of how it should be there. But when you're doing a procedure like hepatogastrostomy, then the models are not going to be, you have to have some hands-on. And like Amol correctly pointed out, these training should be limited to centers which have volumes. And that's the only way we can get over that. Because we don't require to train a large number of people. You don't have to train 400 people in hepatogastrostomy. You just have to see that there are some few good trained people, and then they train other people. So I think we have to restrict these type of procedures only to large volume centers. And in fact, it should have been the society's responsibility to have done that, to say these centers are accredited and recognized. But unfortunately, in our country, it's difficult to do that. Otherwise, if we can restrict, say, third space training to 6 centers in the country where you can get adequate training, then they would be properly trained. And training in bench models can be done anyway, but that's not, I think, you can't go from a bench directly to the patient.
Okay. Thanks, Nagi. Thanks, Amol. Thanks a lot. We move on to the next topic. Sandeep was busy watching. Sandeep,
No, 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 I didn't go.
you didn't go. Oh my God! I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry for that. This is a topic very close to my heart. EOS specific stents, and I want to hear from you. What are the problems currently? We know these are great stents. There is no question. So that is a given. But where is the evolution? Where do you see these stents need to evolve?
So thank you, Vinay, once again, and congratulations on the first anniversary to you, Arunaji, Rahul, and Priyanka worked equally hard. I think the team is very good. So coming to the topic of US specific stents, currently we're using these stents for pancreatic fluid collection, which is kind of standard now, with both plastic and metal and various kinds of dedicated metal stents, which is Axios, Nagis, Paxos, and some other variety of similar kind. Biliary drainage, there are several varieties available, covered, partially covered, fully covered. Then GJ is another new area which has come up. I think the stents, Axios stent is quite efficient there. And last area which is a Waterloo in most US interventions is pancreatic duct drainage. So these are the four broad areas. So coming to the first thing, the cautery enhanced stent, the Axios and Hot Nagi and Hot Paxos have made a huge difference. They have made life easy, saved the steps, because all steps are very critical. And if we can bypass these steps, because we can go wrong in each steps. And if we go wrong, then we have to start all over again. Plus the add-on problem of complications that have occurred by the previous steps. So hot stents are the way to go forward. And they have to be more and more effective and efficient. For example, Axios is a good stent, but very thick. In a awkward position of the scope, it is difficult to push out. Plus, the problem with that stent is that you cannot reconstrain it. If you have deployed the distal flange, I don't think that it can be reconstrained, unlike the Nagi stent, which can be reconstrained if you have misfired the distal flange. So that is where I think if you can go back from one step, two step, and back to one step and reconstrain. So that could be one part of that thing. For biflange stent, in the tubular stent, coming to it, now EOS, HGS and CDS have become kind of standard way of drainage. What needs to be expanded further is now drain the right side of the liver. So far, we're only coming from the left side. Can we drain the right side, which can be done through the duodenal part? And there are some publications which have come from the Korean group where they've drained segment 6, which is quite close to the liver. That's another area to go. And if you need a little more effective stents there. A few things which I just noted while I was doing it. GJ is going to stay. No doubt about it. It is a very effective procedure. And it is much more efficient than an enteral stent. Although enteral stent is easier to place, but if you can make GG much more easier, it is going to make life easy for most endoscopists and the patients, because we are drilling away from the tumor. What we need there is a stent which is a little more wider in diameter. Currently, we are only 20 millimeter maximum. If then make it to 25 or 30, then we are as good as a surgical GJ. And that will make a huge difference in the overall outcome. And that's where the future probably lies. Coming back to pancreatic duct drainage, why this is lagging behind and always a difficult procedure for most endoscopists. That's why it's not shown in most endoscopic workshops, because the chance of failure is very high and nobody wants to show that. I think the devices are still missing. So we need tubular stents which have a cautery enhancement system. So far we have biflange stent with cautery enhancement. We need a sharp, conical, stiff tip which can burn its way through. So that way we can tackle both HGS as well as PD. And if we can place a stent temporarily in a pancreatic duct, we can salvage a lot of these complicated, which Dr. Mahesh was referring to, that we don't know which to drain, and it looks very juicy duct, but we cannot drain it because we are not able to reach it. And this is important because we see this pancreatic duct problem in both chronic pancreatitis and disconnected pancreatic duct and even external pancreatic fistulas, which surgeons do. And these patients end up with having these tubes hanging on for long. And if we can drain that part, we can salvage that pancreas, which delays their diabetes, which improves their digestion. So we actually have to preserve as much as we can what God has given to us. Coming to gallbladder drainage, I think that's an area which is currently safe for patients who are unfit for surgery and malignant cholecystitis, malignancy-related acute cholecystitis. But for benign disease, I think we need to be a little more efficient because that opening has to be closed and sometimes it can lead to perforation because some of the stents move away, unlike the LAMS, which is shown to be effective. But that's only a temporary part we see. We don't see the long-term outcomes, how easy it was for the surgeon to operate at a later date. One futuristic idea is that two things. One is for HGS, if we have a favorable anatomy, not the type 1 stricture, but a borderline type 2 stricture where right and left are about to get separate, if we can have a long stent, a 15 centimeter long, which is 7 centimeters covered and 7 uncovered, can go all the way through up to the right duct, bridging the hilum, and then the covered part covers the left duct and the stomach. That long stent we have requested, and Taivung has been nice enough to provide one prototype, but I'm waiting for the right case to be available. Otherwise, we have to use 2 or 3 stents telescoped inside each other to kind of reform the hilum. Second is the use of we are all benign biliary stricture, another common problem. Post-surgical, post-cholecystectomy, they've undergone hepatocholecystectomy and then they come back with again stricture formation, which they undergo either surgery, which is now they have 2 surgeries, they don't want a 3rd surgery. PTBT is currently the way to go forward. Some of our colleagues from Western world have shown that Manalo especially has done some work on EUS HGS, and so has from French group. So they use fully covered stent and try to bridge that gap. It can be a 1-step or a 2-step procedure, and that's one other way. Or if we have a biodegradable stent which is fully covered, which stays there for some time and then dissolves after 3 months by the time the fistula is formed between the liver and the stomach. And then you can keep manipulating inside and make it open. So these are some of the thoughts that I thought I'll share. One very common thing that we face is when we use plastic stents, you must have seen all these plastics and double pigtail do not have a radio-opaque marker in the center.
No,
we place a marking with a pen.
Yes.
It's such a simple thing to do. Just place a radio-opaque marker, which will work both for us because we are adding a sepsis part because we are using an ink pen which cannot add infection to a sterile collection, or also in a collection which is draining very rapidly, we don't able to see this thing. So if X-ray is there, this stent marker, radio-opaque marker in the middle of the stent would help us exactly position at the time of drainage.
Nagi?
Yeah, no, this is regarding this radio-opaque marker, very interesting. I had the same question, so I asked the company people, why can't you just put a marker there? What's the problem? So both Wilson Cook and Boston told me that if they have to put a radio-opaque marker, they have to again go to FDA for approval, and FDA will want a trial which will cost millions of dollars. So that's why they don't do it. That's the problem. So I think a lot of regulatory problems in this.
Some of the smaller companies have a stent like this, but they're not easily available. They're there in Europe. Plus, some of these metal stents which are there are not very visible fluoroscopically.
Right.
If they can make it a good fluoroscopy, entire length and the central marker which is supposed to be highlighted, that would add value to the stent design and mishaps will be less likely to occur. One small design change which sometimes I keep thinking is that the inner end of the stent, that is the tip of the stent when you do HGS or any other procedure, can be fixed. Then the risk of migration at the time of deployment doesn't occur. You sometimes deploy in the channel of the scope or you pull back the scope, and at that time the stent sometimes slips out. So if you have a mechanism by which it flares open and kind of sticks to the bile duct wall or the PD duct we are draining, then the risk of migration at time of deployment would be much, much lesser. These are some of the thoughts while discussing, listening, I scribbled and thought I'll share.
Great ideas. Nagi, you would like to add anything to it? ERCP or EUS? Stent design?
No, I think stent design, of course, is constantly evolving. In fact, we got much better than what we were long back. I think it's basically the development in the metal industry which is going to make a difference. Actually, stent design itself, we have great ideas and all, but materials are the ultimate thing that determine proper biodegradable material now. So it's a material industry, engineering that is going to make a difference. And ultimately, I think we'll be reaching there once we can get these types of materials.
Okay, thanks, Nagi. So coming to the next topic, Rajesh, I know it's really late in the day. We have two more topics. Rajesh is around?
Yeah, I'm around, Dr. Vinay.
Rajesh, it's really late in the day, but your topic is very close to my heart. And what I have been observing doing EUS is that somehow we leave out hepatology, the liver-related EUS indications. Now, of course, some promise is shown and some studies are coming, but I think there is a much greater role for EUS in liver diseases. So I want your views on what you want to see from EUS in liver diseases.
So thank you, Dr. Vinay, and congratulations for the 1-year completion of Ideal Care. As you keep the topic panel discussion, my dream future, and I'm a daydreamer.
Dream. It's not
I
dream.
always feel dream has no limit.
Yes.
You have to convert into the reality that is more important. And when I talk about hepatology, you know that with an EUS, you can examine the left lobe of the liver from the G junction very closely. You are only 3 millimeters away. You are just on the left lobe of the liver anteriorly. And you can examine the right lobe from the duodenum. Unfortunately, EUS has grown significantly to the disease which is limited or which is disease related to the ducts, but has not grown exponentially related to the liver parenchyma and the vascular. And my dream is that liver should be grown in that area. You know that EUS provide a unique opportunity for us to not only to look at the liver, but to take the FNAC from the liver, where the EUS is the gold standard for getting the tissue diagnosis. And also EUS can look the liver-related complication of portal hypertension, and it also provide a avenue for getting a therapeutic intervention for the liver. My dream, EUS has potential to develop into one-stop shopping for all liver disease. And let me discuss the 3 areas of the liver, because liver has parenchyma, liver has vessels, and liver has the potential to develop tumor or the hilar related tumor. So I think liver has a lot of scope what the interventional radiologist can do. I think in near future, if we develop the data, we can do all the work which our interventional radiologist can do. So let me come to the parenchyma related disease, and the recently quoted term is MEFL, metabolic associated fatty liver disease, and which is exponentially expanding all over the world. And as EUS is very close proximity to it, we can do the measurement of the liver stiffness, and the newer EUS scope has come with the shear wave elastography. So to know the liver stiffness, I think EUS is the modality which you can do the stiffness of the liver, where we are doing percutaneous fibroscan or the ARFI. So I think EUS has a potential to develop the shear wave elastography to know the stiffness of liver. EUS guided liver biopsy, reasonably good amount of data. And I think you all have seen the sham data, which shows that EUS is not superior. But I think when we talk about the comprehensive, then EUS, while doing endoscopy, knowing the liver stiffness, you can take the EUS guided liver biopsy, and we can look for the portal hypertension changes in the form of small collaterals, liver borders, parenchymal changes, as well as small amount of ascites. So to know about the portal hypertension, I think EUS can give the fairly good idea. When we talk about the malignancy, which is originating from the liver or metastasizing to the liver, I see an upcoming role of EUS, because EUS guided knowing about the SCC using the contrast EUS is fairly a good modality, and there are subgroup of the patient of SCC where the contrast enhanced CT scan or the dynamic MRI is not able to clearly visualize. Then contrast EUS or patient who has a renal failure, I think EUS guided contrast EUS can give the idea about the SCC. EUS guided therapy in the form of then SCC in the form of alcohol or microwave ablation or RFA is a possibility. Portal vein thrombosis, either it is a bland or the tumor related, or sampling the portal vein thrombosis to know about is it malignant or it is a bland thrombus, or getting the tumoral cell from the portal vein is a possibility. So I think for the SCC, which is mainly limited to the left lobe of the liver, not only for the diagnosis, but for therapy and differentiating a bland versus there you do a CT scan and then you do an MRI, and to know about the bland versus tumor thrombus, you may require a PET scan. Here with the one modality, you can diagnose. And for the metastasis of the liver, you can take the EUS guided FNA as well as you can do the RFA, or you can do the alcohol injection of the metastatic disease.
Rajesh, while you're talking of tumors, what about TAE? We can't do transarterial embolizations to EUS. Just asking.
I'm coming to that. Coming to that. So when we talk about the EUS guided therapy, there is a possibility that you can puncture the portal vein and you can give the supra-selective injection of the transarterial chemoembolization. And when we talk about the vascular indications, I think EUS for diagnosis as well as treatment of the gastric varices, reasonably very good data available. But in case of chronic liver disease, I think measurement of the portal venous pressure, which is very easy, less invasive, and a compact manometer may be an alternative to the HVPG. Because in HVPG, you have to go and you have to wedge your balloon into the hepatic vein and to know about the gradient. Here you can directly puncture the portal vein, and with the compact manometer, you know about the portal vein pressure. That is going to help. Animal studies about the tips are available, but I think I always feel with the one arrow, you can kill the two birds. You focus the IVC, you focus the portal vein in the one view, and if the stent design is like that, you can puncture and you can do the tips or you can do the dips. Similarly, in a patient of Budd-Chiari syndrome, hepatic vein stenting is possibility. Now, when we talk about the cholangiocarcinoma, you require an interventional radiologist to embolize the portal vein to get the hypertrophy of the opposite lobe. I think EUS guided portal vein thrombosis, and you can help the patient for the cholangiocarcinoma to go for the resection. That is also a possibility. EUS guided portal vein thrombosis, if there is acute thrombosis of the SMV or for the portal vein, Malay has shown 1 or 2 case report, but I think that is also one of the expanding indication which is possible. Now, when you talk about what I want a dedicated accessories, dedicated stents, and a standardization of procedure like EUS guided pseudocyst drainage or biliary drainage. There should be a standardized procedures as well as standardized steps with the minimal risk and an acceptable learning for these procedures. That is also important. It should be acceptable and it should be applicable at majority of the centers, so a large chunk of the patient can be benefited. And we require randomized studies, we require more data to validate these things. So that is my dream future. I think hepatology is an area where EUS has not expanded. For tissue diagnosis, for biliary drainage, for pancreatic fluid collection, EUS has very good role. But I think EUS in hepatology, there's a lot of potential which can be done, I think, by collective effort of all of us, and with the support of company, we can make our dream in a reality.
Thanks, Rajesh. Very comprehensive, fantastic. Let me come back to Nagi. Nagi, why do you think EUS somehow has not gone into the liver? Is it because of the gastroenterology, hepatology divide? If I may ask, why is EUS not being used so much in liver?
No, I think it is now becoming very, liver friendly now. In fact, hepatologists are going to ask more often, especially liver biopsies. We see in our unit now, yes. Hepatologists want the liver biopsies done by endoscopic ultrasound. Yes. One of the problems, of course, is the cost factor. When you do an EUS liver biopsy, it's going to cost much more than a percutaneous liver biopsy. But I think there is now again a recent paper in GI which showed that portal vein measurements, like what Rajesh was saying, can be very good with the US with low complication rate. So I always wonder why we're not been doing that, because there's no point in doing wedge pressures and all that when you can directly measure from the portal vein. We didn't have a proper manometry to do that, but now I think Wilson Cook is coming up with a proper manometry and that can be used to do this. So I feel US is going to become very strong into the hepatology field, much stronger than the other areas, because there is evidence that directly when you compare with other modalities, it is superior, and it's very easy to show the studies to show that it is superior. So I think ultimately we are getting very close to that.
So can I speak something?
Yeah.
Like as I said, there should be a one-stop shopping. Suppose a patient of NAFLD who require a liver biopsy, with an EUS, you know about the changes of portal hypertension, knowing about the varices, knowing about the shear wave elastography, knowing about the stiffness of liver, and you can do the biopsy. In that case, you can do a cost effectiveness also. Here, there you have to go for the 3 procedures. Here in the 1 procedure, you can do the 3 things. So there is a possibility that when we talk when the data is available, we may be able to give the cost effectiveness also.
I think we have to convince our hepatology colleagues more and probably give more talks in the INSL and things like that. That's actually every year, last 5 years, I've been giving this talk in INSL on the role of this and hopefully more of us have to keep doing that and they keep converting.
One comment about Shyam's article on recent data. I think it is not important for US to show that it is superior. We have been doing, like you said, for last 2 years, we have not done a single percutaneous biopsy. We have been doing US guided liver biopsy. We are very happy. Our pathologist is very happy. We are getting adequate number of portal tracks in every biopsy. So if you say here you get 9 portal tracks, there you get 12 portal tracks, I think that's splitting the hair. I would say both techniques are good. Percutaneous is very good, time-tested technique. But for my patients at least, my patients don't want pain of a percutaneous puncture. They can afford. Why not I do a EUS guided liver biopsy? So that is just one response to the paper.
So the other important thing, Vinay, is that when we do a EUS guided liver biopsy, you are owning the patient. It's your patient, so you look after them. If you give it to a radiologist, they just do percutaneous and go off, and evening difficult to get them if some problem occurs also. Yes. So that's the difference also.
Yes, and also the cost. See, my patient goes home because I'm looking at the vessel while I'm doing the biopsy. I know there is not going to be any bleeding. I wait for 1.5 hours and send him home. Percutaneous, you can't send him home. You have to keep the patient for a few hours. I don't know whether that adds to the cost in the West. Okay, so come back to the last topic. This topic we have not covered at all during the day. Mohan? Is Mohan around?
Yeah. Yes, I'm here.
Mohan, this is an extremely important topic, small bowel therapy. I think, again, we have considerable technological advances recently, but I think a lot needs to be done. And so let us listen from you about small bowel therapy.
I think everything started with double balloon enteroscopy. Till that time, I think we were just peeping the beginning of small bowel and then coming out with push enteroscopy. I think small bowel poses a big challenge to all of us because of its long length, and then it is a freely mobile structure where you cannot, push and move forward. You will make loops, and then you need to have devices. So whenever I do ERCP, I am more than 90% sure that I will achieve the success, whatever desired plan I have, even in US, even in third space. But in small bowel, I'm never sure. One, whether I will be able to reach there, whether it will be in the approach of myself, or then what will be the lesion, and whether the bleeding is caused by one lesion or there are similar thousands of lesions. So I'm always doubtful, and it's labor intensive. You may have to wait for 2-3 hours to reach there, and you may not either reach there or you may not complete the job. So it's a very frustrating branch actually. And I think once it is a frustrating branch, there's a lot can be done. And there is no one solution for that. That is why I think combination of CT or MR enteroclysis, capsule endoscopy, and push and pull or balloon assisted or device assisted enteroscopy, if they are combined together, they will bring the best solution for a disease in small bowel disorders. If you want to ask my dream, I will definitely like to have a capsule which can be, moved with my joystick, and I can have an antenna.
I agree, absolutely.
And then I can, if I see something, I can come back. And if I want to take biopsy, I can push button and a biopsy forceps comes, take biopsy. If I want to do the dilatation of that stricture, I can pass a balloon through it and then come back, and I keep on doing my other works also. But that is not going to happen till that time. I think that may take 50 years, but technologies are there. People have shown that there is a maneuverable capsule. There is drug delivery systems coming up. There are biopsy forceps attached to capsules. So everything will come up, but it will take time for the clinical practice. But till that time, I think in a unit, if one has good CT enteroclysis, which determines, I usually divide patients with small bowel disorder as obstructive and non-obstructive or inflammatory in obstructive. So I dedicate more time to study a CT and determine where is the lesion, and then I choose that site and decide about balloon-assisted enteroscopy or power spiral enteroscopy. Second part is bleeding lesions, where I need to have a full length of intestine examined. I will make a plan. I will take a device which can travel throughout the intestine. And then I choose a balloon-assisted enteroscopy versus power spiral enteroscopy. And then you have pros and cons of both systems. Balloon-assisted enteroscopy is maybe good for children, post-operative cases, while power spiral enteroscopy is a major advancement in the field of enteroscopy, but it cannot be done in all patients. You have major limitation in patients who have adhesions. It is freely structure which is not fixed, problem of adhesions. So reaching is a problem, and then therapy itself is a problem. So I think if given a choice, I will use majority of time now power spiral enteroscopy, which has brought major paradigm shift. And within last 1 year, I have seen a major advancement in diagnostic yield of small bowel disorders, which was I have seen around last 10 years. And in last 1 year, there is a major change. And I think this will happen. A capsule with therapeutic capabilities, capsule with maneuverability will also come.
Are you happy with the accessories, Mohan? We don't get enough accessories.
I think more than accessories, we were looking for a scope which has a good channel and a scope which is shorter in length.
Yes.
If that is available, that means you can use all colonoscopic accessories, which are used in, so that has been possible with power spiral. Now, small bowel enteroscopes, which were using balloon assisted, they are 200 centimeter long and 2.8 channel. So by the time you reach ileum, this 2.8 mm becomes 1.8 because of, and then you see angiodysplasia after 2 hours of push and pull. And then by the time you reach the ileum, your APC probe will not pass. And by the time you retract the enteroscope and back into try to straighten it so that APC probe pass, that angiodysplasia disappears.
Mohan has wonderfully brought out the real scenario of small bowel.
So now we were looking for a shorter scope which allows this 3.2 channel, and all the accessories which are routinely available can be used. So this mechanism of pulling the bowel rather than push and pull, if the pulling of bowel, that has made this 168 centimeter scope possible to go into the ileum or IC valve also. And that is why I'm saying the therapeutic endoscopy is improved after introduction of power spiral, one by accessory water channel, because previously when there is a actively dulify in ileum, you will not be able to wash. By the time you wash with syringe and bring the coag grasper or something to stop, that again the pool of blood is there. So practically you take long time to reach and you practically do not do anything. But now I think with this advent, we are looking the brighter side. And then as I told in last 1 year, I'm much happier with small bowel therapeutics as compared to last 9 years.
Okay, so I have missed my presentation in ESG because our discussion was so interesting, but it's okay. So thank you very much. Nagi, any final thoughts?
No, I think we've had a good discussion, and I think with small bowel endoscopy, I think one of the important things is to try and get more of our youngsters involved, because this looks for them like more tedious and not many people are interested in going into this field. But hopefully with the Spirus coming in, and this has to get more people into the field. Otherwise, small bowel would become a dying art. I think this is a problem here.
Yeah, I agree. I think small bowel is like forward short leg position in cricket. Most junior person will get that position.
Yeah.
And but ultimately, those who survive that, and I mean, they have got the opportunity to, because many less number of people take that, they can come into limelight very quickly, and they can be known that there is a lot of, that since it is very cumbersome to do, less people are involved. There's less research, more opportunity to publish. So there are many opportunities in small bowel field.
I always feel that both the side endoscopy to be done simultaneously. One person should do from the retrograde and one person should do from the antegrade.
And shake hands and come back.
And you make sure that patient problems should be fixed.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. This has been a fantastic, really my dream discussion. And thanks for all your inputs. Thanks, Nagi, for being here and giving your inputs. Thanks, Sandeep, Mohan, Rajesh, and I think some others have logged out. Thank you very much. It's late in the night. Have a good evening, a good week. Happy Holi to all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Happy Holi to all of you.
Happy Holi.